All right, guys, they gave me the absolute best slot, right? Like, you're not tired at all, right? None of you? All right, so I wanna start this talk. This is the one?
Yeah, the yellow one.
Okay, the yellow one, not this black one. Okay, great. So I wanna start this talk with a question for the audience. How many of you have a mobile wallet on your phone right now? Okay. How many of you know the security assumptions going into the wallet that you're using? Okay, oh, decent amount, okay. And how many of you trust the security assumptions? Okay, still some, okay, but less and less. There are obviously some people that actually know what's going on, other people that don't, and so on. I'm going to talk about Neutrino, but in order to talk about it, what we need to do is sort of think about what was there before. So let's start with the current situation. So right now, what we have is essentially simplified payment verification. Now, there are other models, and in fact, most of your wallets use something else. But here's the sort of decentralized, or at least needing to trust a single party kind of solution that we have right now, and that's simplified payment verification. This was described famously in the white paper by Satoshi, saying, okay, well, now we have the Merkle root, it's possible to verify that a transaction is in there. It wasn't actually implemented though until BIP37, and that was the first time that you can actually do something like what Satoshi described. The key thing about BIP37 is that it requires server-side filtering. So for every client that connects, the server has to do some amount of work with respect to the actual SPV. Turns out that because of this, it's kind of hard to get the UTXO set. Like the best procedure that you have is if you're, say, trying to recover like a wallet or something like that using BIP37, is you have to figure out, okay, what's the last block before or what's a reasonable last block before my wallet was created. From that block on, you have to go and register a Bloom filter and request the filtered blocks from the server. And, basically keep track of that. And that could be a very long time if your wallet is especially old and so on. And in fact, very few wallets actually use this. In fact, if you're not using a Bread wallet, pretty much every other wallet uses some sort of centralized server, and that's kind of what you are using or trusting with your money in many ways. If you are using like a non-Bread wallet, mobile wallet. All right, so that's, let's just go over very quickly how this works. So the Light client has to create a Bloom filter and then register the Bloom filter with the server. And at that point, the server has to process all the transactions in a block through that filter. So among other things, this is the key sort of bad thing about BIP37 is that on a per Bloom filter basis, it has, and per filter block request, it has to calculate all of this. So there's work for the server to do. And once the server figures out which ones fit that filter, and the filter, by the way, if you don't know, is a superset of the interesting transactions for the Light client, and that's a way to sort of preserve some amount of privacy without downloading the entire block. The Light client at that point has some sort of a proof of inclusion. It knows that it was in a particular block. And they can verify it because the Merkle root is in the block header, and that's how you figure it out. And a Merkle proof looks something like this, and it's essentially, if you imagine HK as the thing being proved, all you need are the blue boxes here, and then you can go all the way up to the Merkle root. You combine HK and HL to get HKL, you combine HIJ and HKL to get HIJKL, and so on until you get the Merkle root. You can check that is the same as the Merkle root in your block header, and that's your proof right there. That's enough to get it. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, there's a bunch of things wrong with this. For the Light client, even if you create a very good superset of your transactions, the server still knows something about what transactions you're interested in, what addresses you might be watching out for, which things belong to you. So that's kind of bad, that privacy loss. The light client can also get fooled by the server, and in particular with a transaction omission attack. So they can give you proofs of inclusion, but they can also just sort of lie to you and tell you that this transaction wasn't included in a block when it was. And you'd have no way to know unless you're checking against other servers and one of them tells you the truth. Once you have one proof of inclusion, that's good enough. But it leaves you vulnerable to some sort of isolation attack and so on. And you would think that that would be it, but there's also another vulnerability, and this is CVE 2017-12842. And essentially, what you can do is you can fake another transaction within one of the nodes at the bottom. And it turns out that this is actually more expensive than creating a legitimate proof of work, and that's like a better way to fool the server, but it does exist. So there are multiple vulnerabilities there. Now for the server, the bad thing is the denial of service vulnerability, and that's because the client dictates what the server should do. So that means that the amount of work it has to do scales linearly with the number of clients it has, or number of Bloom filters that are registered with it. And that is a DOS vulnerability because the more clients you have, the more filter blocks it can request and the more work the server has to do. All right, so the situation we have is something like this, right? Like BIP37 doesn't really work unless everybody kind of trusts each other. I mean, once in a while you might be able to get somebody that you trust to disprove somebody that you don't trust and so on, but this is essentially the situation we have, which is that nobody, like you're forced to trust each other and both sides are vulnerable. Now, what does Neutrino do? And this is a quick overview of what it is. For the client, what you want is privacy, some sort of sufficient proof that something is in some transaction is in a block, and you want to, as best as possible, eliminate that omission attack. You don't want lies of omission to affect you. For the server, you want to remove that denial of service vector and you want to reduce computations. And one of the nice things that would be nice also is reduce storage overhead. I didn't mention it in the previous slide, but one of the things about BIP37 is that you need TX index on. And that's because for any spending transaction, you need to know the previous transaction's output, or the script pub key related to it, so you can run it through that filter. And that's something that you need to keep if you are going to serve up BIP37 requests or respond to those. So some mutual goals that you need are minimizing trust as much as possible, minimizing transmission as much as possible, and minimizing calculation as much as possible. And these are all things that with BIP37, you kind of have to trust each other. You do have to transmit a lot, and for the server in particular, there's a lot more calculation. So here's how Neutrino actually works. The server has a deterministic filter that they can calculate on a per block basis. And this is the key to what makes it more scalable. Instead of having to scale linearly with respect to however many light clients are connected to it, instead you can just calculate one universal filter per block. You can sort of think of it as like metadata about the block, specifically the UTXOs that were involved. And the light client requests a filter for any of the blocks that it gets. So when it requests it, the server already has that filter calculated, so it can just send it back. There's no additional calculation required from the server. And the light client at that point checks the filter to see if any of its own transactions or script pub keys more specifically match it. or go match it. And at that point, if there's a match, then they request the entire block. And the server will send the entire block, of course. And the client can look through all of the transactions and say, okay, well, these are mine, or these are my UTXOs, or my payment was included in the block, or whatever it needs to do. Here's the main pros over BIP37. For the server, it's less doxable, right? And that's because it doesn't have to scale linearly with the number of inbound connections on the Bloom filter. And also, you don't need a transaction index, right? Because on a per block basis, you can just run, you can calculate all of the filters while you're downloading the blocks yourself, and then just keep them around, and then just send it whenever it's convenient or whenever it's requested. The client gets to preserve privacy, right? Because you're downloading entire blocks. Now, the server does know something about you. Whenever you request a block, they may suspect, for example, that you have a transaction in there that you're interested in, but it's a much larger set than what was previous, which was mainly just smaller, like a smaller superset. This one's a much larger superset than BIP37. And lastly, less trust is required. You don't need to trust that the server is giving you something, because the filters are essentially deterministic. The main con is that you need to use more bandwidth. So I've done some testing on this, and just like rough testing around Neutrino. A client filter is roughly 20K for like a 1.4 megabyte block. So you need to download that for every single block, and check that against whatever filter, whatever addresses that you're looking at. So it does require more bandwidth on both sides, but that's a nice trade-off, because you get a lot of good properties. And this is basically the situation that we have. We know when somebody is kind of lying, at least to some degree. Now, there's one lie of omission attack that we still have to talk about, but for the most part, you can kind of tell, that somebody is lying. All right, so what are the remaining vulnerabilities? All right, so first, the lie of omission is still possible, and this is because the server can still send you a bad filter, right? They can send you a filter and say, this is the actual filter for this particular block, but there's no way to really verify that filter right now, right? Like you don't know if they sent you the right filter or the wrong filter. There is a concept of filter headers and so on, and a chain of these headers, but there's no real way to tell other than just sort of ask everybody and see if they come back with the same filter. It should be the same, but again, you can be isolated, in which case you wouldn't know. But this can be fixed. This particular thing can be fixed with some sort of a filter commitment. You can, for example, have a Coinbase commitment to the filter header, in an op return or something like that. Now, we have to be kind of careful with this, because if we do have a filter commitment, it would be a soft fork, number one. And the thing about a soft fork is that it takes a hard fork to undo. So if this is a feature that doesn't really get used, then what do we do, right? So like the clever thing that the core devs have thought of is essentially make the Coinbase commitment like expire after a year. So if no one's using it, then we can just sort of move on and not be forced to have a commitment that nobody uses. But if it does get used, then just sort of extend that like in some way that makes sense. All right, so that's a lie of omission. But the bigger one is a bad block attack. And this is kind of expensive because you still need some sort of a sufficient proof of work. And this is sort of like saying, okay, your transaction was included, I did pay you in this particular block. And the client might believe that they got paid, but there's no way to know that there's a longer chain out there because they're isolated, something like that. But this is not necessarily a problem with Neutrino per se. This is more a problem with light clients in general. And the deep reason is because a light client really can't verify all of the consensus rules. You need to be running a full node in order to verify all of the consensus rules. And this is a fundamental limitation of light clients. And that's something that you can't really prevent per se. It's just something that's inherent to a light client, right? Like you can either make everybody a full node, in which case you can fix this, but at that point you have all of the drawbacks of running a full node, which is that the bandwidth consumption, the calculations that you have to do, and all this other stuff. So we are at a security conference, and unfortunately, this is the reality of a lot of security-related things. Is that nobody really appreciates security until something breaks, right? Like at which point they're like, well, you didn't do a good enough job. Which is to say that there are alternatives to Neutrino, and here's some alternatives that are out there in the wild today. So first one is some sort of a trusted setup. So you have a node that you completely trust. Maybe it was set up by you or something like that, and you communicate with your mobile wallet to that trusted node. And as long as you have good encrypted communication or some method of communicating that you find secure, then you can do everything that you would need to do on a mobile wallet. And this is, I think, the model that Electrum uses for certain, if you set up your own Electrum server on the other side, you just trust your own Electrum server to tell you all of the right answers. In which case, you don't need Neutrino at all. You can just use, like just straight communication. You might even keep all of your UTXOs on the server, so you don't have to worry about it if you're restoring a wallet or something like that. Second one, you can trust some sort of a third party, and this is how most mobile wallets currently work. If you're using Mycelium, for example, that's they all call back to Mycelium servers, and as long as you trust Mycelium, it's fine. But if you don't, with your privacy and so on, then it kind of sucks. But that's one way to do it. That's another way to do it. The third way is you can trust some combo of third parties, and this is sort of like some sort of like majority rules kind of thing, where you connect to a bunch of them, and this one is compatible with Neutrino, where you can request from 7 different people, and if they all agree, it's fine. If a majority agrees, then you go with that, something like that. And if you get multiple ones, you have to have some other contingency for that particular failure mode. But you have to trust some combination. But again, you can get isolated, in which case you still can be deceived by some sort of a bad block. So to summarize all of this, Neutrino is definitely a strict improvement, mostly, I guess other than bandwidth, over BIP37. Right? And that's a very good thing, because BIP37 is broken in many ways. It requires way too much trust, and both sides can get screwed over on that. And but it's no excuse to not run a full node, right? Like, you should still run a full node, in large part because Neutrino has no way to validate all of the consensus rules. So, if Neutrino light wallets, they're probably appropriate for up to a certain amount. I'm not going to tell you what that amount should be, but it's probably good enough for a certain amount of Bitcoins. But past that, you really should be checking against like a full node that you trust all of the data that's coming in, because it is possible for the servers to deceive you, even if it's at a certain amount of cost, including creating some proof of work. And the final point that I want to make is that light clients have that fundamental vulnerability, right? Which is that they can't check all of the consensus rules. And this does open us up to some level of attack, kind of like what Bitcoin 2x was supposed to be, which is that all of these servers sort of go in a different direction, you have no idea which consensus rules that it's following. And this is why it's so important to run a full node, because if you are running the full node, then you know exactly which consensus rules you're following. And at that point, you know which coin is being transacted instead of some sort of a hard fork or like SegWit2x was supposed to be. And you don't have to trust third parties for that. And this is the real sort of concern for a lot of core devs and a lot of developers in general, which is that, do we want people running like clients? Because, there's still that vulnerability. And many say like clients are dead for that reason. If you're not going to check the consensus rules, kind of like you're at the mercy of whoever you are trusting, and it's possible that they do something nefarious on your stead. So that's essentially the main thing that we have to think about with respect to like clients, and this is something that Neutrino helps with. One thing I forgot to mention in a previous slide, Neutrino is sort of a setup for a lot of the Lightning stuff, which is also a big benefit. And you can use it for light wallets, but it's also useful for Lightning as well. So. Anyway, that is all of it. There's my PGP key in case you didn't see it. It's on all of my social, accounts. So you could have gotten it that way. I actually think I have to convince you that I'm the same person as on Twitter than the other way around. So anyway, I think that's it. Thanks. Any questions?
Hi, Jimmy Song. Thank you very much for this excellent talk. So in terms of malicious filters, let's pretend like a block has 4 addresses that it affects, A, B, C, and D. I happen to be A, and I request a filter. As soon as you realize that I'm interested in that block, couldn't you start doing malicious filters where the next filter you start to give me is A and B? And then the next one is C and D, and then the next one is A and D, and the next one is C and B, purposefully to see when I request more blocks so that you can actually find out which address affects me. And
yeah, you could do that, but I think once you get the filter and it's like if you request A and it's not in there, then you would just kind of move on. There's no back and forth there. Right, and they can only serve, if it serves you more than one filter, you immediately know that they're doing something fishy because the filter is supposed to be deterministic per block. So if you get a different filter for the same block, then okay, they're being sketchy, you should cut them off.
So imagine in block 10, I say, given the filter you gave me, I'm interested in block 10. Are you saying all of the filters for all, let's pretend like there's 100 blocks, are given before I ask for blocks? Because in my attack, in block 10, I'm interested, and then you start giving me bad filters after block 10.
Yeah, so, I guess it's possible on a network level. You can ask for the block filter for block 10, and then do something, and then ask for it on 11. But generally, because they're deterministic, you just get a whole bunch of them at once. In fact, the network message is give me 100 of these block filters, right? The client isn't likely to do that, but it's possible that there are enough blocks where the server can figure that out and say, okay, well, in this group of blocks, I'm just going to do A or B, C or whatever. If you're relying on a single server for all of your data, then you are sort of vulnerable to that. But oftentimes what you could do is request filters from many different ones. And because there's a filter header which has a chain, you can know immediately that one, if you request 1 to 100 from one peer and 101 to 200 in another peer, then and the headers don't match, right? Block 100 isn't connected to block 101, or filter 100 isn't connected to filter 101. then you'd know that the first one is sketchy right away. So that's a good way. I mean, this is up to the software developers that use Neutrino, of course, but that would be one way to figure out if somebody's being honest or not.
And just a quick follow-up, do you think it makes any sense for privacy reasons to occasionally request for blocks that aren't your...
Yeah, probably. And that would certainly sort of throw them off the scent on exactly which addresses you might be interested in, especially if it's like a block with like one transaction or something. I mean, not that we've had those in a long time, but it's possible for them to figure out at least some of that. So yeah, it might be a good idea to request blocks that you don't necessarily need as a way to throw them off, or you can just request them from different servers, right? And as far as they might know, you know, they don't get that much information if you're doing it from different peers. But again, if you're isolated, then you're kind of, yeah, they might know a lot already.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Other questions? There's another person over there.
Thank you, Jimmy. I think this is useful on the debate over Neutrino. My thought, I wanted to know your opinion, is that if you are convinced that you have to run your own node and you can access securely to it in a encrypted way, in a hidden way, then probably BIP37 is superior to Neutrino for the bandwidth and CPU-intensive work on your phone.
Yeah, well, so if you already trust the server...
because it's yours.
What's that?
It is your node running in your house, and you access to it with your phone.
Yeah.
So in that case, or you are running an Electron server, or BIP37 is okay.
Yeah. So if you trust the server, you don't need to use BIP37 really. You can just be like, hey, construct the transaction for me. Here's the XPub, something like that. And that's a lot quicker than having to get Merkle proofs of every UTXO and things like that. So there's a more efficient protocol for that. So there really isn't a place for BIP37, and I think this is the heart of your question. Is there a place for BIP37 in a post-neutrino world? I don't think so, because if you trust them, then you're going to want to use something that's a lot more efficient. And if you don't trust them, or you trust like some majority or something like that, then you would want to use Neutrino in some clever way. So yeah. Other questions? All right, I think you guys can go get coffee now. Thanks.